Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, and members of the court, thank you for this opportunity to speak today. I come before you to discuss a question that sits at the heart of our constitutional order, and at the center of our understanding of justice, the relationship between faith and law, and how a justice of this court reconciles his personal convictions with his solemn duty to uphold the Constitution. This is not a theoretical question. It is a practical, pressing question that affects every citizen who turns to the judiciary for fairness, predictability, and reasoned decision-making. Let me begin with a simple yet profound question. When the law speaks and faith speaks and they diverge, what does a justice do? Does he choose one over the other? Does he attempt to fuse them in a careful balancing act? Or does he remain silent, hoping that neither is provoked, neither is questioned, and neither is scrutinized? This question, I argue, is central to the role of every Supreme Court justice. And it is precisely this question that I raise today in the presence of Justice Neil Gorsuch, a jurist whose brilliance is evident, whose jurisprudence is admired, and whose personal faith is well known. The question I pose is simple to state but difficult in its implications. How does one reconcile publicly professed faith with the obligation to apply the law impartially and transparently? It is an issue that goes far beyond abstract morality. It reaches into the practical administration of justice, into the very trust that the public places in this court. It reaches into the perception of fairness, which, let us not forget, is often as crucial as fairness itself. Now I wish to clarify that I am not questioning Justice Gorsuch's integrity, nor am I questioning his intelligence. Far from it. He is a jurist of enormous capacity. But even the most capable jurist must grapple with the tension between faith and law, because no matter how principled, every human being carries within him moral intuitions, religious beliefs, and personal commitments that shape how he perceives the world. The crucial question is whether and how those beliefs shape the interpretation and application of law. Consider this: the First Amendment enshrines the principle that government shall neither establish religion nor prohibit its free exercise. On its face, this seems straightforward. Yet in practice, it raises a host of complex questions when a justice believes in a particular moral truth derived from faith, and that truth coincides or conflicts with legal text. How does he navigate the choice? If the outcome aligns with his faith, does he recognize the convergence and explain the reasoning? If it diverges, does he bracket his convictions and rely purely on law, or does he find a creative path to harmonize the two? These are not academic questions, they are questions of principle, and they matter to every litigant who seeks clarity, fairness, and reasoned explanation. I ask directly, Justice Gorsuch, you have spoken publicly of your Christian faith. You have also described yourself as a textualist and an originalist, committed to interpreting the Constitution according to its text and historical meaning. Yet on the record, you have not fully explained how your faith interacts with your interpretive methods. Is this silence an oversight? Is it a purposeful strategy? Or is it, perhaps, an acknowledgement that the bridge between faith and law is a delicate one, not easily articulated in words? Whatever the reason, the silence itself is telling. Silence, in this context, is not neutral. It communicates whether intentionally or not, and that communication has consequences. I would argue that the public deserves to hear how faith shapes, or does not shape, a justice's reasoning. When that voice is absent, when the justice refrains from clarifying how personal conviction intersects with constitutional interpretation, the gap is filled by speculation. And speculation, in turn, undermines public trust. Citizens may wonder, is the decision grounded in law? Is it guided by text? Or does personal belief, unarticulated, drive the result? The very legitimacy of this court rests upon the appearance, as well as the reality, of reasoned impartiality. To understand why this matters, let us examine historical precedent. Our legal tradition consistently emphasizes neutrality and justification. The courts must show, not merely assert, that their rulings rest upon law rather than personal preference. Textualism and originalism, the interpretive philosophies Justice Gorsuch espouses, are not incompatible with moral reasoning or even faith-based intuition. But they require transparency. The reasoning must be visible, traceable, defensible. The public must see the path from text to outcome, from precedent to application. When that path is obscured by silence, confidence in judicial reasoning suffers. Silence in the face of these questions carries additional weight because of the unique position of a Supreme Court justice. This is a role imbued with enormous authority. Decisions made here have consequences that ripple through the lives of millions, affecting rights, liberties, and the very fabric of society. If a justice silently allows personal faith to influence decisions without explanation, the public is left guessing, and the court's moral authority is diminished. A justice may indeed act with integrity, yet absent explanation, perception of bias becomes unavoidable. And in our system, perception is power. It shapes how society interprets rulings and accepts or resists judicial authority. Let us take, for example, cases where religious freedom is implicated. A justice's personal faith may incline him to view certain exercises of conscience with greater sympathy. That is understandable, it is human. But what is required is articulation, an explanation of why, given the law and precedent, a particular outcome is reached. The public, and indeed the lower courts that look to the Supreme Court for guidance, must be able to trace the reasoning. When faith informs judgment but is unspoken, the reasoning is partially hidden. It leaves the decision susceptible to accusations of subjectivity, even if no subjectivity exists. This is why I say your silence, Justice Gorsuch, is deafening. Let me be clear, I am not demanding disclosure of private devotion, nor am I questioning the sincerity of belief. Rather, I am emphasizing the need for clarity in legal reasoning. Faith, when it interacts with law, must be bridged by argument, by logic, by references to text and precedent. This is what distinguishes moral intuition from legal reasoning, and it is this bridge that has been left unspoken, silent, yet palpable in its absence. To illustrate, consider how other jurists have historically confronted this challenge. Judges who hold strong moral or religious convictions have often taken pains to explain how those convictions inform, but do not override, their legal interpretation. They show the public and the bar that they are aware of potential biases, that they recognize the influence of personal belief, and that they actively work to ensure the primacy of law. The silence of a justice who publicly professes faith but refrains from explaining its role is striking precisely because it leaves this work undone. It invites uncertainty. It invites doubt, it invites critique, and it need not. So, Justice Gorsuch, I pose this central challenge: how do you calibrate your faith in your role as a Supreme Court justice? When you sit in deliberation, when you draft opinions, when you vote, how do you ensure that faith informs without dictating, that it illuminates without imposing, that it guides without compromising legal neutrality? And if you choose not to make that calibration publicly explicit, why should the public expect clarity in your decisions? Why should litigants trust that the scales of justice are balanced and transparent? My argument today is simple: silence on the interplay of faith and law is not absence of influence. It is an influence in itself. It communicates more than it conceals. It suggests either an unawareness of personal influence or a purposeful choice to obscure it. Neither is conducive to public confidence in the judiciary. In a nation where the judiciary is already under scrutiny, where questions of impartiality are hotly debated, silence is a risk the court cannot afford to take lightly. To conclude this opening segment, I wish to emphasize that the questions I pose are not meant to embarrass, nor to challenge the personal faith of any justice. They are meant to provoke thought, to stimulate transparency, to encourage articulation of reasoning that ensures the public can follow the path from belief to law. Justice Gorsuch, your silence has been deafening, but it has also illuminated an essential truth: when faith and law intersect at the highest levels of adjudication, clarity, explanation, and transparency are not optional. They are mandatory. This is the question I leave you with as we begin this dialogue: will the public hear the bridge, the reasoning, the explanation of how faith and law co-exist in the mind of a Supreme Court justice, or will silence continue to speak louder than reason? The answer to that question will shape not only our understanding of individual rulings but our trust in the court itself. When we examine the work of the court, we see moments where the tension between faith and law is unavoidable, where the personal beliefs of a justice could plausibly intersect with constitutional interpretation. Take, for instance, cases in which religious liberty is directly implicated. There are decisions in which the outcomes suggest a deference to faith, or an accommodation of conscience. Yet the reasoning remains elusive to those of us outside the chambers. Justice Gorsuch has joined opinions that recognize the protection of religious exercise, yet rarely has he articulated how his own convictions shape his understanding of that protection. We are left with the question: is the decision driven entirely by constitutional text, or does personal belief exert an unspoken influence? And if the latter, how can the public, The litigants and even lower courts assess the impartiality of the reasoning. Consider the hypothetical scenario in which a justice's faith teaches that human dignity is paramount. Suppose a case arises involving a claim under the Equal Protection Clause. The constitutional text is clear in its broad guarantees, but ambiguity remains in application. How does the justice navigate this terrain? Does he rely on the moral intuition supplied by faith as a compass to interpret the text, or does he deliberately set aside personal belief to interpret the law strictly according to historical meaning? If he chooses to rely on intuition, yet provides no explanation, he invites skepticism. Silence in this context is not neutral, it becomes a lens through which the public interprets the decision, often in ways that may suggest bias, however unintended. We can observe similar patterns in several decisions. When a justice joins opinions that favor religious exercise in public institutions, it is necessary to ask whether the reasoning rests on neutral legal principles alone or whether personal faith informs the outcome. The difference is not trivial. If faith informs the decision but is not disclosed, the appearance of impartiality may erode. Trust in the judiciary depends on the visibility of reasoning, on the ability to see clearly the path from law to outcome. The public must understand not only that the ruling is consistent with law, but also why the ruling is consistent, how competing considerations were weighed, and why one outcome was chosen over another. Silence in this area leaves a vacuum where explanation should exist, and speculation inevitably fills it. It is not enough to say, the law guided the decision. The law is interpreted through reasoning. Every justice must navigate interpretation, weighing precedent, historical practice, and the text itself. When faith potentially informs interpretation, transparency is crucial. Without it, the reasoning becomes opaque. The absence of explanation creates an impression that the decision was guided by personal moral judgment rather than by law, and perception matters. Citizens may accept a decision they disagree with if they understand the reasoning, but when the reasoning is obscured, they may distrust the process entirely. The credibility of the court relies not only on adherence to law, but on clarity of thought, and the willingness to explain that thought. One might argue that it is unnecessary for a justice to reveal personal belief, that the strength of legal reasoning should be evident in the opinion itself. Yet, even the most rigorous textual analysis may conceal underlying values. Every human interprets text within a context of experience, morality, and belief. A justice who acknowledges faith in public discourse but refrains from explaining its potential influence on decisions creates a paradox: publicly visible belief, yet opaque reasoning. It is this paradox that raises concern. If faith has no influence, silence leaves that assertion untested. If faith does have influence, silence conceals it. Either way, the public is left uncertain. This uncertainty has practical implications. Consider lower courts and litigants who rely on Supreme Court precedent to guide behavior and interpret law. If the reasoning behind a decision is incomplete or silent regarding potential influences, the guidance is partial at best. Judges interpreting these opinions may struggle to determine which aspects of reasoning are binding precedent and which are informed by private belief. This uncertainty may lead to inconsistent application of law or cautious avoidance of areas that might be perceived as faith-influenced. In this way, silence does not merely affect perception, it affects the functioning of the judiciary across the country. We must also consider the broader social implications. In a pluralistic society, where citizens hold diverse beliefs and expectations, the visibility of reasoning is a stabilizing factor. When the public sees a justice articulate how personal conviction aligns with legal principles, it fosters understanding, even if the outcome is controversial. When reasoning is opaque, speculation can inflame partisan perceptions. Citizens may believe, reasonably or not, that decisions are guided by particular religious views, undermining the perception of neutrality. Trust in the court is not a matter of abstract principle, it is a living bond between the judiciary and the society it serves. Silence weakens that bond. It is possible to honor personal faith without compromising legal neutrality. A justice can acknowledge the presence of faith, explain its role, and demonstrate how law ultimately governs the outcome. Such explanation does not weaken jurisprudence, it strengthens it. It demonstrates intellectual rigor, self-awareness, and respect for the public. It shows that the justice is not simply acting on moral intuition, but is applying reasoned legal analysis, informed by conscience but constrained by law. When this explanation is absent, as it has been in some cases, the result is ambiguity that invites criticism, speculation, and sometimes cynicism. Let me emphasize, This is not a question of morality versus legality. It is a question of methodology and transparency. Faith may inform moral understanding. The Constitution governs law. The justice must articulate the interface, demonstrating how he navigates the terrain between belief and text, intuition and precedent. When that articulation is missing, the public sees only the outcome and the unspoken influences. They are left to wonder which path was followed and why. That is the risk inherent in silence, the risk that trust, credibility, and perceived impartiality are eroded without anyone intending it. Moreover, there is the matter of consistency. The court's authority rests on the predictable application of principles. If one decision is influenced by faith, and another is influenced differently, or influenced but not disclosed, the perception of inconsistency grows. Citizens and scholars are left to speculate about when faith matters and when it does not. Over time, these gaps in explanation accumulate, creating a narrative in which law appears secondary to personal belief. That narrative, whether accurate or not, is damaging. It undermines the clarity and coherence that the public expects from the highest judicial authority. Consider also the educational function of the court. Supreme Court opinions are not merely rulings, they are teaching instruments for lawyers, judges, and citizens. They articulate reasoning, set precedents, and shape understanding of constitutional principles. If the role of personal belief is omitted, the educational function is incomplete. Readers cannot fully assess the robustness of the reasoning, nor can they evaluate how conclusions were reached. The court teaches best when it shows both the law and the reasoning path that leads to the application of that law. Omission, silence, and opacity hinder that function. Ultimately, my concern is simple. The silence of a justice in the face of questions about faith and law is deafening because it speaks on its own terms. It signals an absence where explanation is required. It leaves citizens and scholars guessing. It risks the appearance of bias. It diminishes the perception of legitimacy. It obscures precedent and weakens jurisprudential consistency. And it diminishes the authority of the court as a moral and legal institution. Silence, in this context, is not neutrality. It is a message, and that message is one of ambiguity, uncertainty, and unspoken influence. I urge the court, and Justice Gorsuch in particular, to consider the responsibility that comes with acknowledged faith in public life. The public does not require disclosure of intimate beliefs, nor does it demand the surrender of personal conviction. But it does require transparency about how convictions intersect with legal reasoning, especially in cases where faith could plausibly influence interpretation. This is not a question of personal devotion, it is a question of institutional integrity, public trust, and the clarity of jurisprudence. The path forward is clear. Justice Gorsuch, like all justices, has the capacity to articulate the bridge between faith and law. It can be done through footnotes, concurring opinions, or careful explanation of reasoning. The goal is not to expose personal devotion, but to ensure that reasoning is visible, traceable, and understandable. That visibility strengthens trust. That visibility strengthens doctrine. That visibility strengthens the moral authority of the court. In closing, the silence that we have witnessed does not merely leave questions unanswered. It amplifies them. It creates space for speculation, doubt, and misunderstanding. It leaves the public uncertain about whether decisions are guided by law or by unspoken belief. And it weakens the confidence that every citizen must have in the impartiality of the judiciary. For the law to command respect, and for the court to maintain its integrity, justice must be seen and understood. Silence in the context of faith and law falls short of that standard. It is time to speak, to explain, to articulate, and to bridge the divide between personal conviction and constitutional duty, so that the public may understand the reasoning and trust in its fairness. Let us now turn from general principles to a concrete example, a case that illustrates precisely the tension between faith and law, and the challenge of transparency when a justice's personal convictions may intersect with the reasoning behind a decision. Consider Masterpiece Cakeshop v. Colorado Civil Rights Commission. In this case, the court addressed a situation in which an individual refused to provide services for a same-sex wedding on religious grounds, raising questions about the scope of religious liberty under the Free Exercise Clause. Justice Gorsuch joined the majority opinion, which ultimately found that the commission had demonstrated hostility toward religion in its proceedings. While the outcome was clear, the reasoning presents an opportunity to examine how faith interacts with legal interpretation and the implications of silence on that interaction. At the heart of the case was a collision of rights: the baker's religious convictions and the customer's civil rights to equal treatment under the law. In such moments, the court's responsibility is not only to reach a just result, but to demonstrate how the law, rather than personal belief alone, drives that result. Justice Gorsuch's participation in the opinion demonstrates a careful attention to legal precedent and constitutional text. Yet the court's reasoning, while thorough in textual terms, offers minimal insight into how the justice's publicly acknowledged faith may have shaped his understanding of the Free Exercise Clause, the weight of religious conscience, or the interpretation of state regulatory authority. Here again we encounter the challenge of silence. It does not necessarily indicate absence of influence, rather, it leaves the influence invisible and open to interpretation. The question arises: when a justice's faith plausibly informs their sense of moral propriety, how should that influence be integrated into legal reasoning? One approach is to make the reasoning explicit, demonstrating how the law accommodates moral and religious concerns while remaining anchored in constitutional text and precedent. This involves articulating not merely the conclusion, but the bridge, the reasoning that connects personal intuition, legal history, and textual interpretation. Without this articulation, the public, and indeed the lower courts, are left with an incomplete picture. They can see the result and the legal citations, but they cannot fully evaluate the pathway the justice took to reach that conclusion. They cannot discern whether faith played a guiding role, was carefully bracketed, or simply coincided with the law's requirements. And in this absence, speculation inevitably fills the void. Consider the hypothetical: if a justice believes that religious exercise is inherently valuable and must be protected wherever possible, how does that belief interact with legal analysis? Suppose the text provides a standard of neutrality, but also leaves discretion to weigh competing interests. The justice must decide: do I interpret neutrality strictly, or do I accommodate my moral sense of religious liberty? If that moral sense informs the interpretation, and the justice does not explain this interaction, the court's reasoning becomes partially obscured. The public and scholars may wonder whether the ruling reflects law, conscience, or both. The integrity of judicial reasoning relies on visibility. When the bridge between faith and law remains unarticulated, confidence in the impartiality of the decision may diminish, even if the justice acted with the utmost integrity. This is not merely a theoretical concern. The stakes in such cases are tangible, affecting the lives of those who bring claims, those who implement decisions, and those who observe the judiciary to understand the limits and protections of constitutional rights. A ruling in favor of religious exercise without transparent reasoning leaves the perception that personal conviction, rather than neutral interpretation, has carried the day. Conversely, a ruling against religious exercise without explanation leaves faith communities uncertain about the court's commitment to protecting conscience. In both instances, silence breeds doubt and diminishes trust. The public deserves reasoning that clarifies, contextualizes, and bridges the gap between conviction and constitutional obligation. Another dimension of concern is consistency. The court's authority rests upon predictable, reasoned application of law. If one ruling reflects deference to religious liberty and another reflects a narrower view of similar claims, the public and lower courts must be able to trace the principles guiding each decision. If faith informs some rulings but not others, without explanation, the pattern becomes opaque. Scholars and practitioners cannot confidently discern whether decisions are consistent, whether precedent is being applied uniformly, or whether personal belief selectively shapes outcomes. This uncertainty undermines the authority and credibility of the judiciary. Transparent reasoning, even when it acknowledges the presence of personal convictions, safeguards doctrinal coherence and reinforces the perception of impartiality. We must also consider the educational role of the court. Supreme Court opinions serve as guidance for lawyers, lower courts, and the broader public. They articulate principles, demonstrate reasoning, and exemplify how constitutional text and precedent operate in practice. When a justice's reasoning is silent regarding the potential influence of faith, the educational function is compromised. Readers cannot fully grasp how legal principles are applied in complex, morally charged situations. They may admire the outcome or even accept it, but the reasoning remains a partially hidden instrument. Transparency strengthens understanding, silence weakens it. It leaves future interpreters without insight into the balance struck, the considerations weighed, or the rationale behind pivotal choices. It is crucial to distinguish between disclosure of personal belief and articulation of reasoning. The former is unnecessary and intrusive, the latter is essential. The public need not know the intimate details of a justice's devotion. They do, however, need to understand how a justice's reasoning navigates potential conflicts between belief and law. This distinction is subtle but vital. Transparency does not compromise personal faith, it enhances confidence in legal judgment. By explaining how personal perspectives are assessed against law and precedent, a justice demonstrates intellectual rigor, accountability, and respect for the judicial role. Silence, in contrast, allows private influence to remain unexamined and the court's reasoning to appear partially concealed. Masterpiece Cake Shop exemplifies this challenge. The opinion carefully addresses procedural fairness and constitutional standards, yet offers little insight into how a justice's personal conception of religious freedom, potentially informed by faith, intersects with legal interpretation. The public sees the law and the outcome but not the reasoning pathway. They are left to wonder, was the decision shaped solely by legal principles, or did moral and religious intuition play a role? In an institution that relies on reasoned explanation, speculation is the enemy of legitimacy. When the public cannot discern the reasoning, trust is inevitably compromised. The justice's silence, intentional or not, amplifies this effect. Moreover, silence in such cases can carry broader societal implications. Citizens of diverse backgrounds with varying beliefs and commitments observe the court as a neutral arbiter. When reasoning is opaque, particularly regarding faith, speculation arises that decisions may favor certain worldviews over others. Even if no favoritism exists, perception matters. The court's moral and institutional authority depends on the belief that it applies law impartially. Transparency in reasoning is not merely desirable, it is a safeguard against misunderstanding, mistrust, and cynicism. Silence erodes that safeguard. In reflecting on this case, and others of similar nature, we see that the challenge is ongoing. A justice who acknowledges faith in the public sphere must balance personal conviction with constitutional fidelity, must reconcile intuition with text, must harmonize conscience with precedent. The opportunity exists to articulate reasoning clearly, to demonstrate that law, not belief alone, governs the outcome. This articulation protects both the integrity of the decision and the perception of the court as a fair and principled institution. Failure to articulate, by contrast, allows the influence of faith to remain hidden, and the reasoning to appear incomplete or biased. The lesson is clear. Justice Gorsuch, and indeed all justices, must recognize the responsibility that accompanies acknowledged faith in public life. Faith and law need not be in conflict, but their intersection must be transparent. The public deserves to understand how convictions are evaluated, how they inform reasoning, and how they are ultimately integrated within the framework of constitutional law. Silence in these matters is not neutral, it is influential in its absence, leaving the public to fill the gap with speculation, uncertainty, and doubt. In closing this discussion of a concrete case, the challenge remains: how does one reconcile faith with law in a manner that respects both, demonstrates transparency, and maintains public confidence? Masterpiece Cake Shop highlights the difficulty, yet also the path forward. A justice may be guided by moral and religious understanding, yet still produce reasoning that is visible, traceable, and grounded in constitutional principles. The public, lower courts, and scholars must see that reasoning. Without it, the silence is deafening, and the court's authority is diminished. Transparency, clarity, and articulation are not optional, they are necessary to maintain the legitimacy, consistency, and moral authority of the judiciary. As we step back from individual cases and consider the broader implications, it becomes clear that the silence of a justice on the role of faith in legal reasoning has consequences far beyond a single opinion or a single litigant. This is not merely an academic concern, it is a question of institutional integrity, public trust, and the moral authority of the court itself. When a justice acknowledges personal faith but refrains from explaining how it intersects with legal interpretation, the effect is multifaceted and profound. First, let us examine the question of legitimacy. The legitimacy of the judiciary depends not only on the outcomes of decisions, but on the perception that those outcomes are reached through reasoned and impartial application of law. Citizens must believe that rulings are grounded in law, that decisions follow from precedent and constitutional principles, and that personal belief does not dictate outcomes. When a justice's reasoning is silent regarding faith, the public is left to speculate. Was the decision guided purely by text and precedent, or did unarticulated personal conviction play a role? This uncertainty can erode confidence in the judiciary, not because of actual bias, but because the appearance of impartiality is obscured. Trust, once weakened, is difficult to restore, and the court's ability to function as a neutral arbiter is compromised. Second, silence undermines doctrinal coherence. The court's authority relies on consistent and traceable legal reasoning. When faith influences a decision, but that influence is neither acknowledged nor explained, future judges, scholars, and practitioners are left without insight into the guiding principles behind the ruling. Precedent becomes harder to interpret, legal reasoning becomes fragmented, and the predictability of outcomes diminishes. Over time, this lack of transparency can lead to the perception that decisions are inconsistent, or that personal belief shapes the law selectively. Clear articulation of reasoning, showing where and how personal convictions intersect with constitutional interpretation, helps maintain doctrinal integrity and ensures that precedent is applied uniformly. Consider also the moral authority of the court. The judiciary is not merely a legal institution, it is a moral one. Its authority rests on the belief that it applies law fairly, rationally, and impartially. When a justice remains silent on the potential influence of faith, the court risks diminishing its moral authority. Citizens may respect the individual justice, but they may respect the institution less, perceiving it as guided by hidden convictions rather than reasoned legal principles. Moral authority is not earned simply by reaching just outcomes, it is reinforced when the reasoning is visible, transparent, and understandable. Silence undermines that reinforcement. Moreover, transparency in reasoning serves an educational function. Supreme Court opinions are not only rulings, they are teaching instruments, guiding lawyers, judges, and the public in understanding the law. They demonstrate how legal principles are applied, how precedent is interpreted, and how complex conflicts between rights are navigated. When the role of personal conviction is opaque, the court's educational function is compromised. Readers cannot fully grasp how the law operates in morally charged situations. They may admire the outcome, they may even accept it, but the reasoning, the map that explains how the decision was reached, is incomplete. Transparency strengthens understanding, silence weakens it. The broader societal impact must also be considered. In a diverse society, citizens come from many religious and moral perspectives. They rely on the court as a neutral arbiter, a body that enforces the law consistently and fairly. When reasoning is silent regarding faith, speculation arises that decisions may favor particular worldviews over others. Even if the court acts with complete integrity, the perception of favoritism can erode public trust. In a system that relies on consent and confidence, perception matters. Transparency in reasoning, especially where personal conviction may plausibly influence interpretation, is essential to maintain the public's trust. The opportunity exists to address this challenge without compromising personal faith or legal judgment. A justice may acknowledge that personal belief informs moral understanding, but must demonstrate that the law, not belief alone, governs the outcome. This can be achieved through careful articulation, showing how convictions are considered, bracketed, or aligned with text and precedent. Footnotes, concurring opinions, or explanatory passages can serve this purpose. The goal is not disclosure of private devotion, it is transparency in reasoning. The public, scholars, and lower courts must be able to follow the path from conviction to constitutional interpretation. When this path is visible, confidence in the judiciary is reinforced. When it is silent, trust is weakened. There is also a matter of accountability. Justices wield immense power, and their decisions shape the rights, freedoms, and obligations of citizens. Accountability does not require confession of private beliefs, it requires clear articulation of reasoning. When reasoning is transparent, it can be evaluated, debated, and understood. When reasoning is silent, accountability is obscured, leaving the public to guess at motivations and the guiding principles behind rulings. The silence is deafening because it leaves questions unanswered, speculation rampant, and trust fragile. Furthermore, transparent articulation of reasoning reinforces the legitimacy of precedent. Lower courts and future justices rely on Supreme Court opinions to guide their understanding of law. If reasoning is incomplete or silent regarding potential faith influence, the applicability of precedent becomes uncertain. Judges may struggle to determine which principles are binding, which are discretionary, and how similar conflicts should be resolved. By articulating reasoning, the court ensures clarity, stability, and predictability in the application of law. It is important to emphasize that transparency strengthens, rather than weakens, jurisprudence. A justice who explains how personal conviction intersects with legal analysis demonstrates intellectual rigor, self-awareness, and respect for the rule of law. Such explanation does not compromise independence, it reinforces the integrity of the court. Silence, by contrast, leaves influence hidden and invites doubt. In a pluralistic society, where confidence in institutions is essential, transparency is indispensable. So what is the path forward? The court must recognize that acknowledged faith in public life carries a responsibility. Justice Gorsuch, like all justices, has the capacity to articulate the intersection of personal conviction and legal reasoning. This articulation can be precise, careful, and limited to the role faith plays in interpretation, without revealing private devotion or allowing personal belief to override constitutional text. The goal is clarity, visibility, and traceability in reasoning. When this is done, the public, scholars, and lower courts can understand the basis for decisions, assess consistency, and maintain confidence in the court's impartiality. The challenge is both practical and moral. Silence may seem safe, but in reality, it is powerful, and not in a neutral way. It conveys uncertainty, leaves reasoning partially hidden, and allows perception of bias to take root. By articulating reasoning clearly, a justice reinforces trust, strengthens doctrine, and maintains the court's moral authority. Transparency bridges the gap between personal conviction and constitutional duty, showing that law governs outcomes, even when conscience informs understanding. It is a safeguard for legitimacy, consistency, and credibility. In conclusion, the silence of a justice regarding the role of faith in legal reasoning is deafening because it speaks in the absence of explanation. It leaves citizens uncertain, scholars guessing, and the judiciary vulnerable to the perception of partiality. Transparency, on the other hand, strengthens trust, reinforces doctrinal coherence, and preserves moral authority. Justice Gorsuch, like all justices, has the opportunity to articulate this bridge, to show how personal conviction is considered, aligned, or bracketed within constitutional interpretation. Doing so is not a concession, but a reaffirmation of the court's role as a principled, reasoned, and impartial arbiter. The public, scholars, and lower courts deserve reasoning that is visible and traceable. The law deserves reasoning that is articulated, justified, and defended. Faith, when acknowledged, deserves clarity about its role so that it neither dictates outcomes nor remains hidden. Silence is a choice, and it carries consequences. Transparency is a responsibility, and it carries benefits. It is time for the bridge between faith and law to be spoken, not left to echo in silence. The court, and Justice Gorsuch in particular, must embrace that responsibility, for the integrity of decisions, the confidence of the public, and the enduring authority of the judiciary depend upon it.